It's really great that we've got Aaron, Giselle and Eva here. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment before we start diving into our conversation. I'm Elizabeth. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at the Digital Poverty Alliance. For those of you who are new to us, welcome. We are a charitable coalition bringing together government, industry, charities and communities with the aim of ending digital poverty for once and for all in the UK by 2030. And we do that through a range of different pieces of work. We do it through research and advocacy. So we're working this year towards our National Delivery Plan, which will build on our evidence review launched last year, looking at all of the causes of digital poverty, the very different determinants which range through access to devices, through to support, skills, motivation, data, and then trying to bring together our alliance and as many players externally as possible to address all of those problems in a concerted and coherent way by the end of the decade. And we also run a number of programs which are helping people right now by getting devices, data, skills, mentoring to those people, and then also gathering evidence about how that's helped them, how that works, and why that is so important to tackle amidst our current cost of living crisis here in the UK. So if you're not familiar with our work, Ellie, who has just introduced herself in the chat, will pop a link to our website and our community hub so that you can get involved in some of what we do. I feel like we've probably got the majority of people online now, so I'm going to go around the room and just ask our fabulous panelists to introduce themselves quickly. So we'll start with Aaron, mainly because he's in the top left of my screen.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name's Aaron Slater. I'm Digital Inclusion Manager at SCVO, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations. We're a membership body that supports, promotes and develops Scotland's voluntary sector with over 3,000 members, and I am the manager in our digital inclusion team. So we do all things building digital inclusion capacity and capability and supporting the wider sector to do digital inclusion work. And yeah, despite the accent, I'm not representing Northern Ireland today, I'm representing Scotland.
Brilliant, thank you, Aaron. Giselle.
Hi, Jo Lovell, working for Compass. I'm the Director of Inclusive Communities. Compass was formerly the Wales Cooperative Centre that some of you attending may recognise. Established 40 years ago. We're a cooperative development agency, and basically we act for social change. We believe that there's a better way of delivering services and better ways of the economy running. So we support social enterprise, new starts, growth. We run digital inclusion programmes, cooperative housing. So there's a whole range of services that we deliver. But in particular, I'm also responsible for Digital Communities Wales, which is a Welsh digital inclusion programme. Thank you.
Amazing, thanks, Giselle. And Eva.
Hi everyone. I'm Eva Henson. Despite my accent, I am representing Northern Ireland. So I'm the Policy and Public Affairs Officer for NICVA, so that's the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action. We're a membership umbrella organisation for members of our sector in Northern Ireland. My role is to create and advise on policy that's in the best interest of the sector.
That's great. Thank you all very much for being here today. We're going to spend about half an hour having a bit of a chat. As I say, audience members, do pop your questions in the chat, in the Q&A function. Just to get us kicked off, much as digital poverty is something that actors across society need to drive, not just government, how much of a priority do you each think that the national governments in your home nations place on digital inclusion and tackling digital poverty? Aaron, I'll come to you first again this time.
So in Scotland, and I do feel quite lucky to work in the digital inclusion field in Scotland, because I feel like it definitely does feel like a priority from our national government. So there's been a commitment to it for a number of years now, and we've been working on this agenda for about 10 years too, alongside Scottish governments. What I find really interesting about how it's prioritised in Scotland is, yes, it's a priority, but also how it's contextualised, how it's framed, and it sits very much within social justice and social inequality, and that's kind of the backbone of how we kind of work through and understand digital exclusion in Scotland, and I feel like that's a really good framing exercise kind of from the get-go. We had an updated digital strategy in 2021, and I suppose notable in that is that it's a joint strategy between Scottish Government and COSLA, which is the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities that represents local governments. So it is a joint strategy between national and local governments. And kind of front and centre in that strategy is the first chapter is called No One Left Behind, and it's really positioning kind of the idea of people in place and digital inclusion as kind of being front and centre in that strategy. So that's really great. Although strategy is one thing and talk is cheap, talk can be cheap. So I think kind of seeing that backed up, especially in the wake of the pandemic, through initiatives like Connecting Scotland, which was a kind of the brainchild and born from the then chief designer in the digital directorate in Scottish Government, Kat McCauley. She kind of conceived the idea of what became Connecting Scotland, and the government put £48 million behind that to connect 60,000 households. So for me, that was a really good kind of follow through and taking action on kind of that priority around digital inclusion. But where probably I see at the moment where it's really interesting and where there's real within government action around digital inclusion is health and care. So our Digital Health and Care Directorate in Scotland and Scottish Government have been doing some really interesting work and really prioritising the digital aspects of health and care delivery. So for example, they've done a few initiatives so far around, there's been a lot of work around Near Me, which is the video consulting platform for health and social care powered by Attend Anywhere. And that's really been driven over the last year or so, but also some interesting work around social care and care homes. So during the pandemic, offering free MiFi connectivity and iPads to every care home in Scotland. There's a programme called Digital Lifelines, and that's looking at, although Scotland, I feel, does really well with digital inclusion, or drug death rates, or I suppose if digital inclusions are pride, maybe drug deaths are part of the shame. But there's a programme looking at how digital can help preventable drug deaths and better health outcomes for people who use drugs, and some new work coming along around mental health as well. So some exciting work there, some more innovation around digital health and care, and really looking at where digital inclusion can sit and play a role in all of that. So I think, yeah, it does feel like a priority. And there's been some really great work and hopefully some more good work to come along.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aaron. That's a really comprehensive overview. So thank you. Eva, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, so I'll start with the positives for Northern Ireland first. So it's nice to start on a high note. So firstly, it's important to note that whilst Northern Ireland, just like the rest of the UK, is heading towards more and more services being online, all services that are provided by the government and government departments are still accessible by phone or by written applications. So things like benefit claims, housing executive claims, bus passes, all of those services are still accessible offline. So still accessible to people who don't have any digital skills or are living in digital poverty. The Department for Finance also, just quickly to touch on, it also funds a scheme called Go on NI. So this is a free service to encourage people who are not computer literate to learn basic digital skills, such as online banking or safety online, how to stay safe online. But to try and measure the priority and the success of the Northern Ireland Assembly in regards to digital poverty is it's really difficult. Some policy areas aren't the responsibility of the devolved government here. So the shared rural network, for example, which aims to improve rural connectivity, that's the responsibility of the UK government. There's also a big focus on infrastructure with regards to digital poverty in Northern Ireland, and infrastructure over here is renowned for being quite slow and a little bit disorganised. So at present, including the shared rural network, there are 5 projects aimed at increasing broadband speed and connectivity, 2 of which are rural area specific. So although these do seem to be increasing productivity, this is only one area of digital poverty that's being tackled, and there's little to show the measure of tackling it as a whole. So just to pop in some statistics here, 32% of the population of the working age in Northern Ireland, so that's dictated as between 16 years old and 65 years old, they have no basic digital skills. So there are schemes in place, such as the Go on NI, which I mentioned before, but you do ideally have to have some basic skills, basic digital skills to access these services. And during COVID-19, all of the classes, all of the help was put online. So you had to have basic digital skills to then learn basic digital skills. So it was a catch-22. And then lastly, there's a great deal of policy confusion in Northern Ireland. So the 7 different executive strategies which mention aims to tackle digital inclusion and digital poverty. And there is a lot of financial backing, but they're at a really, really high level and they're quite vague. What Northern Ireland lacks, I think, is the political appreciation of the various issues that cause digital poverty and an overarching strategy for it.
Thank you, Eva. And I've seen some comments in the chat around a call for that digital inclusion strategy. And hopefully that's something that the DPA can work with you guys on, because it is really, really important that we start to see that kind of joined up approach in home nations and across the entire UK. Giselle, last but not least, Wales.
So a bit like Aaron, I feel really lucky actually to work in Wales on the digital inclusion agenda. From a Welsh Government perspective, they funded digital inclusion programmes for over 15 years now. So it's always been important to Welsh Government. And, you know, we can see the numbers reducing. So we're now at about 7% of the population who would still be classed as digitally excluded. From a government perspective, they've developed an ecosystem. So we have the overarching digital strategy for Wales that was launched in 2021. And there's 6 missions that sit underneath that. And the thing that I really like about it is that it's cross-policy, cross-government responsibility. It doesn't just sit with one area of government, which I think probably is what the situation is in the UK. At least we've got that kind of cross-responsibility. So the missions are around services, inclusion is one of the missions, skills, economy, connectivity, and data. Sorry if you can hear, but we're in the middle of a thunderstorm and that's the hail. So if it's a bit noisy behind me, I'll apologise. So we have the overarching strategy. All of Welsh Government's areas are responsible for part of that and have a responsibility to it. Underneath that, then you've got different layers. So you've got the Centre for Digital Public Services that's focusing on digital transformation of the public sector. You've got Digital Health and Care Wales that's specifically looking at digital transformation for the health sector. We have chief digital officers that sit within local government, within Welsh Government and within the health. And so that's, you've got that ecosystem, and then you've got Digital Communities Wales. So I think the way that the Welsh Government approaching it is taking a very responsible approach to it. It is making a difference, slowly but surely. But I think moving forward, it's making sure that nobody gets left behind with that transformation. And that's going to be the challenge with so many services going online. It's how we keep equality at the forefront of everything, because we saw it in the pandemic. A lot of people were left behind. The work that we do through Digital Communities Wales, we try and use that cascade model, because I say we're a small team. There's about 26 of us, but we cover the whole of Wales. And if you think about 7% of the population being digitally excluded, that's quite a lot of people to reach. So we try and work through organisations to ensure that the staff have the skills and the confidence to then support their end users in whatever kind of model that is. It's just a way of us being able to reach a lot more people, and it's more, we think it's more of a sustainable model, because then you're creating those champions who are always there to support the people that they work with.
Thanks, Giselle, and thanks everybody for all of those insights. That's a really kind of thorough scene-setting piece, so much appreciated. And of course, Aaron, the Scottish Government made a commitment to provide every child with a laptop before the end of their term. I imagine that would have a massive impact on digital poverty. How is that going? Is that rollout going as fast as you would like to say, or Do you think that could be sped up?
It's a really interesting one, that specific commitment from the Scottish government. So that was every child from P1 to S6, which is about 700,000 pupils, would get access to a device and also to a free connection where needed. And I think that connectivity part is really important there too, so that when the child goes home, they're able to continue their studies and make best use of the device. I think to start off with, I suppose kind of the impact, inevitably, a huge impact. We think about how much we all rely on technology and being connected to the internet to enhance learning and to be able to do the things that you need to do through education. What I quite liked about that commitment is that it's universal for all children, so it's not means tested. And there's something there for me about equity, and that every child in a classroom has access to the same device. So every child's kind of on a level playing field in terms of having that access and doing kind of the same things on those devices. In terms of the rollout, I know it has kind of read some potential criticisms of it. It's not going quite as fast potentially as we would like to hope, or a lot of people might like to hope. Digital inclusion things can never really go fast enough for most of us, I think, anyway. I think kind of as a bystander looking in from the outside, it's an arrangement between Scottish government and local government. So I think that inevitably will create some complexities. A lot of local authorities through their education team started distributing devices before this commitment, and indeed some of them before the pandemic. And I noticed, I was looking some stuff up, I saw some press articles that were criticising some local authorities for giving out devices in schools pre-pandemic, which feels a bit short-sighted, or it hasn't really aged well now, given how important that feels to education. But yeah, I think it's a positive commitment, it's a good commitment. I know it's not going as fast as a lot of people would like. I think at the last count was maybe about 280,000 devices were going out. And there will be complexities there around funding provided by Scottish government versus funding being used by local governments. So all of that in the mix. I do think, though, what's quite important is that it's a really positive step towards addressing digital poverty, but also thinking about the needs of the wider family as well. So that's great that children in education get those devices. I imagine, pretty sure that they'll all be locked down to some extent because their education devices owned by the school and to keep children safe. But thinking about the wider needs of families as well, especially families on lower incomes, and what access do they have at home, which is kind of to supplement children's education and to do the things that they need to do as well. So positive, maybe a bit slow, and definitely more work to be done around the wider family.
Thanks, Aaron. And that connectivity piece is something we're definitely going to come back to later on in this session, particularly with reference to affordability of broadband and data. There's another interesting point, of course, around rural connectivity, and there are in all of the home nations, there's incredible challenges in certain areas, but it's particularly relevant, I think, to the Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Do you think the current measures are sufficient to ensure that all households even have access to, even taking that affordability piece away, even have access to fast and reliable internet access? And I might start with Giselle.
Okay, so there's still lots of rural households that don't have access to that fast and reliable broadband. Welsh Government have quite a few different programmes that people can access, or communities can access. So there's the Superfast Broadband programme, there's the local community broadband, and a few other schemes. So whether you're an individual looking to either get your connection or an increased connection, I think it's up to 30 megabytes per second. So there are schemes in place. I guess the challenge that Welsh Government have, as will the other devolved nations, is broadband and infrastructure is actually UK government responsibility. It's not a devolved responsibility. So whilst Welsh Government have invested a lot of money into the infrastructure to enable people to access better broadband, you know, and it is improving, but it's still not every household that has access to it yet. there is that question around, are they just doing UK government's job and having to use their budgets from other areas to plug that gap? So it's always a tricky question when it comes to who funds the infrastructure. But like I said, there are programmes in place. There's one with Oggy that's being rolled out to help local communities. I think the challenge will be, though, the faster the broadband, usually the more expensive it is in the rural communities. And that's something that we hear in a lot of the debates and conversations that we have with organisations across Wales is, it's great, but we've got to pay more for it. And we know that people are struggling to pay even for cheap broadband at the moment. So actually that's probably going to put them off.
Yes, definitely a challenge of Gigabit Britain is you can make lots of expensive and whizzy things available, but it doesn't actually mean that people can afford to buy them. Eva, how about in Northern Ireland? You touched on it earlier.
Yeah, so I was conscious not to go into it in too much detail, but in short, the answer is no. I don't think the current measures are sufficient. Rural connectivity in Northern Ireland, in rural Northern Ireland, is a huge issue. And it's reflective of the challenges faced in rural communities in general with regards to infrastructure over here. Around 1 in 5 households in Northern Ireland do not have full fibre broadband, which essentially means quite fast broadband. Most of these households don't even have broadband which meets the universal service obligation. And these homes are mostly in rural communities. Only 18% of people who live in these areas in rural communities are over 65, so over what's defined as a working age. So that leaves a huge amount of people within that working age bracket with, at best, quite low grade broadband access. So as I mentioned earlier, there's huge issues with regards to infrastructure in general within rural communities. So taking that into account alongside these issues, rural communities and people living there are the least connected to services that offer free internet access. So they, for example, infrastructure, the transport is pretty poor. So to get to libraries, for example, with free internet access is more difficult for these people than it is for people living in urban communities.
Sounds pretty dire, to be honest. It sounds extremely difficult to live what a lot of people would sort of consider a normal online life with those kinds of challenges being faced just every day for so many people. Alan, I suspect Scotland's probably going to have a slightly better picture than Eva's just described.
So yes, Scotland, about 70% of people live across the central belt. We have large areas of land, large areas remote and rural. We've got island communities in Orkney Isles and Shetland. We think about the Highland Council as well. It's the largest geographical council in the UK. It's a third of Scotland's landmass, and it's also Scotland's lowest population density at about 8 people per square kilometre. So remote and rural is a big challenge. There are some things around infrastructure. So Scottish Government has a Reaching 100% or R100 initiative, and that's looking at superfast broadband access for everyone. And that's at 30 megabits per second installed in every home and business in Scotland by 2028. So there's some progress on that. I know last year they laid 16 subsea cables to island communities, to 15 different islands, which is great. So there's some progress on that. But that kind of fixed access and broadband access isn't necessarily for everyone. And thinking about cost of living crisis, and a lot of people prefer to manage their connectivity through pay-as-you-go. It may not be the most cost-effective way, but for a lot of people, that's the best way that they want to manage their money. So thinking about 4G connectivity as well. And again, that is a big challenge for remote and rural parts of Scotland. So there's things like, there was Ofcom in 2019 Connected Nations report said that about 20% of Scotland, which is mainly in rural areas, don't have 4G coverage. So there are some things like there's the Scottish 4G infill programme, which is looking at addressing up to 55 not spot areas by building new masts. And I know there's also stuff happening through the extended area service, part of the emergency services network for 4G masts, looking at how that can be opened up for commercial access as well to improve 4G connectivity. And that's all really important, especially for people living in remote and rural areas. And we think about, I suppose, rural economies and allowing people the opportunity to be able to live and work in areas where they can do that, given that most of our work's done online now, and to have the infrastructure to do that. Think about healthcare access. If you live in island communities and you need to access specialist healthcare in the mainland, the travel time, the travel expense that takes, the toll it could take on your own health, making those journeys. So being able to do that remotely as well, and having the proper infrastructure connectivity to be able to do that. And I suppose also add the kind of access to skills support as well in remote and rural areas is a challenge. So having the connectivity is one thing, but is there someone or something nearby that actually could provide you some of that support as well to develop those skills? So a huge challenge, some interesting initiatives kind of bubbling away in the background to help address that, but potentially some way to go. We're not quite there yet with that connectivity.
Which is, of course, only one piece of the picture, but such an important one. And I've seen a few comments that, yes, something we say a lot, just throwing laptops at people alone will not fix digital poverty. Thinking about the mix of people who need to support the action that's needed to ensure a digitally included society. Giselle, you mentioned earlier Digital Communities Wales, and you were talking a bit about the work. How does the private sector get involved in that? What is their role?
Okay, I was thinking a lot about this actually. So it's one of the areas that our programme is going to focus more on this year. We have done work with some of the major banks in the past, and we have engaged with some local businesses. One of the challenges we have, obviously in Wales, we have the Welsh Language Act that we have to adhere to. And quite often a lot of the very big private sector companies that support digital inclusion programmes on a, say, pan-UK level won't translate their materials, and therefore we're not able to promote it or work with it because it's not adhering to the Welsh Language Act. So it can get quite difficult when they're very set in their ways and that they won't do the translation of that material. We've just commissioned a piece of research that should be finished in the next 3 months that's looking at digital inclusion and the effect on small businesses. So we want to try and find the links that how we can better work with the small businesses. Because if you take the makeup of businesses in Wales, the majority of them would fall under micro businesses to SMEs would make up the majority. So what we want to look at is how can we work through them to reach their customers who are digitally excluded. So I'm going to be really interested to see the outcome of that research over the next couple of months, because it's a model we tend to apply. If we think there's an issue somewhere, we'll do a bit of research on it, see what recommendations come back, and then try and focus our work in that direction to address it based on the recommendations. So I think there's definitely more that the private sector can be doing. You know, there's lots of good things happening. So, you know, we know the Digital Eagles programs. Barclays, if I'm allowed to name a specific bank, have done a lot of work going into care homes. So there's a lot of activity taking place in Wales, like I said, but one of the issues for us is around the translation of materials, but where we can work with organisations, we will. And like I said, for me, it's specifically looking at those smaller businesses to see how we can work through them to better reach their customers.
Fantastic. And yes, I mean, small businesses across the entire country can play a massive role. And this is something that's really important to us, is not just expecting that government or big business are necessarily going to provide the solutions, even if they should, whether they'll actually be able to or not. So it's great to hear you've got that kind of small business focus yourself.
Definitely. And I think more and more moving forward, if you just look at the economy, the news stories day in, day out about how businesses are being affected with the rise of utility costs at the moment, I think we're going to see more businesses probably closing down or moving to an online model. So actually, the sooner we can engage with them to understand the issues, and then that's going to help in terms of not only their businesses surviving moving forward, but also for us reaching more people.
Terrific. So I think there's something really inspirational in there, probably for all areas in terms of thinking about how to do that. And Eva, in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of community and voluntary organisations certainly trying to tackle some of the digital inclusion barriers. How do you work together? How do you share best practice? What sort of challenges do you face in joining that up?
Yeah, so at present there's no formal forum or committee aimed at sharing best practices for digital inclusion for the community and voluntary sector that we're aware of. However, we understand that it's on their radar. So during a COVID-19 impact survey, which NICVA sent to all NICVA members, digital skills was ranked as second when asked about the most pressing skill development needs. Internet access for service users of the sector was also highlighted as a really topical issue. We're also finding that, just as Giselle was saying there, private sector are closing their physical services, so such as bank closures. The sector's having to bridge that gap. So people, for example, are heading into community hubs and asking for help accessing these services from people working within the sector. But with regards to sharing best practice, as I said, there's no formal committee that we're aware of, but the tackling digital poverty and inclusion has become almost a byproduct of other groups. So sector forums aimed at tackling poverty in general, or for example, isolation in older people, they all include digital poverty. So just to use a personal example, in a previous job, in a previous role, I did some work on animal welfare, specifically puppy breeding. So there are plenty of APGs, all party groups and forums to discuss animal welfare. One of the issues faced was that puppy breeding is generally a rural concern, as in that most of these big illegal puppy farms that you've seen on documentaries and things are rural based, and then by default so are the people who are unwittingly buying puppies from them. The information on how to buy a safely and well-bred puppy is out there online, but the information is A, maybe not very easy to find, and B, impossible to find if you don't have access to the internet or you don't have the digital skills to do so. So the effects of digital poverty and the talk of how to tackle it reaches probably a bigger spectrum than you even imagine. So just to quickly summarise, a formal space to share best practices, an area lacking in Northern Ireland, but it is something that NICVA would be happy to look at and support, and happy to help people make those connections.
That sounds like an amazing offer, Eva, and one that I hope that people will want to take up. And I think that's such an interesting piece. Yes, puppy farming to digital poverty. It's not an obvious link. It happens to be something I care about quite deeply, but it's not an obvious link. But isn't that absolutely a perfect example of how, if you're not online, you can't access either what you're interested in or what's relevant to you or really important information? That the expectation is, well, it's out there and it's available. Yes, but if I can't access it, is it available? Well, not to me. So we have to start breaking down those barriers and getting that greater sense of awareness of why this is a really crucial issue. And it entirely ties into why digital is a basic right. And it's not a luxury, it's an essential utility to access what people need to know in the modern era that we're living in. There's one more question that I'm going to ask you all. I can see that we've got some questions starting to come in on the Q&A function. If you're one of our attendees, please do have a think about whether there's anything you'd like to ask our wonderful panelists when we've got them all together. There is a big question, and actually I'm going to come back to Eva because you've just been talking about this, but who should be leading the digital inclusion agenda in your nation? Is this for local government? Is it for national government? Is it a combination? Is it somebody else who should be actually really pushing forward and setting that strategy? So I'll start with Eva.
Yeah, so for Northern Ireland, I think that both the Northern Ireland Executive or the Northern Ireland Assembly and the UK government should be leading the digital inclusion agenda together, ideally. Northern Ireland has the highest percentage of non-internet users in the UK. It does have its own area-specific hurdles, which we've discussed earlier, so such as 1/3 of its population live in rural areas, and all of those issues that produces. So it does have to be looked at a local level, but I do think that it should be part of a bigger strategy within a UK government strategy.
Thank you. Giselle.
As I always say, it's everyone's responsibility. Totally agree with Eva. It needs to be driven by government across all departments to show the importance of it. But ultimately, if you're an employer, you've got a responsibility to ensure that your staff have the basic digital skills, as opposed to presuming they have, to be able to do their job. So we do a lot of work with doing skills audits with organisations, and you may or may not be surprised the amount of people that don't have the basic skills that they need. So I think, you know, employers have a responsibility, businesses have a responsibility. If you want to reach a wider audience, connect with different customers, it's local government's responsibility. You know, if you want to move your services online, you have a responsibility to ensure the citizens that you want to use them can access and can get onto those services online. Otherwise, you're creating a further inequality. So for me, everybody has a responsibility to deliver on it. It can't just be seen as it's somebody's problem over there and they'll deal with it.
A brilliant introduction to why our national delivery plan is so focused on ensuring that we divide up those tasks and we don't rely on any one actor, including government, to just make it happen, because otherwise we'll still be waiting. We'll still be having these conversations in 10, 20 years. Aaron, Scotland.
Yeah, same as Eva and Joe. I will always talk about digital inclusion as a collective responsibility. Everyone has a role to play. Yeah, good for national, local governments to be kind of setting the strategies out and kind of driving that at that level. But I think it's leadership at all levels. It's, you know, we see it in the voluntary sector, we see organisations leading the way, inspiring other organisations to do great work. Like in Scotland, our Simon communities work with the homeless people, and they're doing great work around digital inclusion. We see it at local governments, pulling people together in a kind of place-based approach. I know I've seen Diane Webb from Renfrewshire Councils on the call as an example of a really great kind of local government leading digital inclusion. I think it's one of those ones, digital inclusion, it's multifaceted, it's complex. There's different elements of it, and I think it's working out who sits best under each of those pillars, who play to people's strengths. You know, your trusted relationships for building skills and confidence, where does that sit? Connectivity, where's the leadership from the telcos and who can influence them, and how do we think about data poverty? And also thinking about who's actually designing and developing, delivering digital services. Everything we do is on a platform or on a service or on an app. Someone's developed those, someone's created them. What responsibility do they bear for accessibility in the widest sense of what responsibility do you take to help make this an easy platform for someone to use with low digital skills? How easy are your services to navigate? Where are you showing leadership on this issue and designing digital services in a way that are inclusive and make it easy for people to use? So I think it's across all sectors, and everyone has a role to play.
Brilliant, thank you, Alan. We're going to start moving on to some of the audience questions. So I won't necessarily come to all three of you for every question, so that we can get through them. But if you come off mute, I'm going to take that as a hint that you'd really like to answer this question. So the first one is from Sarah Williams, and it's around tackling digital poverty and tying that into exclusion in education at all levels. And Giselle, actually will come to you first, because Sarah's highlighted that, of course, Wales has led from the front by introducing digital literacy in schools as the third literacy in the curriculum, but that doesn't match up with the level of digital access. So how do you feel about that?
Okay, so it's probably not my area of expertise, so I'll kind of answer with caution if that's okay. But firstly, I think it's brilliant that digital literacy is recognised in the curriculum. I think that's really, really important. I would like to see all schools working the same. So for instance, when my daughter was in secondary school, her first year, they were all issued with iPads. and that's continued, but not all schools did that. So again, you've got that kind of inequality about what one school gets and what one school doesn't get. I think there's a role for education to do more around digital skills, just really bringing it into a real life context. But I also think one of the challenges is, and you know, it was mentioned earlier, when you talk about giving devices out, that's great. But quite often the children, if they're not shown how to use those devices properly, or if they're, say, like a Chromebook versus an iPad that's really intuitive, we know the Chromebooks are slightly different to use. And if they're not shown how to use them, quite often the parents don't have the skills to show them to do it either. So, you know, if you're going to put those programs in place, you have to have the support mechanisms to support the children. One of the things we've just reintroduced, actually, because we had to stop during the pandemic, is our Digital Heroes program, where we go into primary schools and we're looking at creating a secondary school model, go in, do some work with the primary school children, and they become digital heroes, and will connect to a local care home or facility that's local to them, so they can actually go in and support the residents in that care home with the skills that they've used and show them how to use technology and different things. So we've just started looking at starting to deliver that again as part of our programme, which I think is a really good way of connecting in terms of the young people being able to put into practice what they're learning as well in terms of those digital skills. I hope that answers it a little bit. Oh, you're still on.
And if I came off mute, wouldn't that be good? It wouldn't be a webinar if somebody didn't stay on mute while they were trying to talk. Thanks, Giselle. I was just going to hand over to Eva.
Yeah, so I was just going to, again, like Giselle, it's not my area of expertise, but I will just quickly mention some points. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, the Department for Agriculture actually funded quite a scheme on quite a small level, where they gave higher level education students extra money who live in rural areas, to sort of try to bridge the gap between them paying more for broadband, or if they have to use their phone or for whatever. So people did benefit from that. I think it did have pretty good a pretty high take, but that on a wider scale in Northern Ireland would be something that was useful. I was also just going to touch on the fact that basic digital skills is constantly moving, so it's really hard to ever be able to reach that point. So at the moment we do have like a goalpost that we want to reach of basic digital skills, but it will forever be moving. So once upon a time, I don't like to think of myself as very old, but when I was doing my ICT GCSE, basic digital skills were Microsoft Word and PowerPoint and Excel, and that was it. Now it's online banking and how to communicate effectively online. I know that there's schemes in Northern Ireland to get children into coding even, which is just far beyond anything I could ever imagine doing. So the concept of trying to tackle digital poverty, I think, will constantly be a battle to catch up, because it will constantly be, the goalposts will constantly be moving.
That is such a good point. And as we look towards 2030 and trying to end digital poverty, we all have to be incredibly aware that we have no idea actually what might be normal by that time and how technology will shift. That leads us on actually really well to a question from Stevie Patterson, which is, are there specific areas that come under the term digital skills that people in business should or do refer to around device use, physical and mental safety, and so on? Who would like to jump in on that one? Aaron.
Yeah, Stevie, I think for us, we kind of, when we talk about digital skills, we put everything within the essential digital skills framework. And a few reasons for doing that, one of which is it's a UK-wide framework, and Lloyds Bank use it as part of their annual Consumer Digital Index, so it's a really useful benchmarking tool. It's recently been updated, and I know, Joe, you were on the group as well, looking at how we update it, because as Eva said, digital skills will continue to evolve technology continues to evolve, so our requirements to be able to use it will always evolve. So any skills framework will need constant updating. We use it because it's quite useful. It's got 5 different headings. So communicating, transacting, handling information and content, problem solving, and being safely legal and confident online. And then under those, you've got different tasks that kind of demonstrate competence in each of those areas. We find it a useful framework, and the feedback we've had from stakeholders and people working frontline in communities, they find it a useful tool as a practitioner and also as a framework for thinking about where to start with new learners. And it's got a list of skills for life and skills for work under those 5 headings. So it is kind of transferable across your day-to-day skills and more practical skills for the workplace. So we do find it quite useful to use, but we do kind of internally constantly struggle with it as well and think about, is this now as relevant as it could be? Do we need to adapt it again? Are there things we're missing out? And what actually is, how to keep it simple and kind of keep it to essential skills without going over the top. But I would say, yeah, have a look at the Essential Digital Skills Framework, and it's adaptable as well, and we always adapt it, and the kind of stakeholders we work with tend to adapt it to meet their needs if they work with specific client groups. Adapt it to their needs, so it is quite a useful tool for that.
Brilliant, thank you, Anna. Tom McGrath from Good Things Foundation has asked, and this is probably going to be a tricky question to answer live, but how do you feel about your respective governments' commitments to digital inclusion, particularly as we head into a recession? Do you feel it provides opportunities for new innovative approaches like the Minimum Digital Living Standard project? And Tom highlights that they're working with the Welsh Government and Liverpool and Loughborough universities on that. Eva.
Yeah, so I think I've probably been quite explicit about how I feel. So far, it's quite generally accepted that the government isn't doing enough here with regards to digital poverty yet, but it's not to say that they aren't doing anything. And I know I probably came across as quite a skeptic during the panel questions there, but it's not all doom and gloom. The statistics, for example, 1 in 5 homes not having full fibre broadband, it's better than 2 in 5 people, which it was a couple of years ago. So that has risen by something like 75,000 households in the last couple of years. So it is something that we can improve on, but you also have to be mindful that it will be slow. It's not something that's just going to happen overnight. And you also have to be mindful that people, residents living in Northern Ireland, some of them just aren't interested in digital skills, and despite bank closures or post office closures and the need to have these basic digital skills, they just don't want to learn them. So there will always be people that you can't reach, unfortunately. But yeah, it is more could be done. To summarize, more could be done, but things are being done. And I know I probably sounded really skeptic, but it will be slow, and it's just something that we have to work towards together, I suppose.
It's no problem with skepticism. That is often confused with realism, and realism is really, really important. Giselle.
Hey, firstly, hi Tom. So we also work with the Good Things Foundation. They're a partner on the Digital Communities Wales programme, and Compass are also supporting the Minimum Digital Living Standard work with Good Things and Loughborough and Liverpool University. So I think from a really positive perspective, Welsh Government have commissioned a piece of work alongside the UK Minimum Digital Living Standard to look at a specific for Wales. We'd like to think they'd probably come out at the same thing, but you don't know. You need to wait until that's been determined. And then I think the role for us is how we implement that. How do we get people to adopt those recommendations? What does that really mean for people? As part of Digital Communities Wales, we have the Digital Inclusion Alliance Wales, which is a network of over 80 organisations across Wales, across all sectors. So we'll be looking to the Alliance to really drive forward the recommendations that come out of that. We also have the Future Wellbeing Generations Act, which is thinking about everything a public service does. You have to think about future generations. So actually a minimum digital living standard really plays into that act. So I think we've got the framework through different acts in Wales to really make a difference. In terms of the current programme that we deliver, it's funded until 2026. So thinking about kind of where we are at the moment, moving into a recession. So your point, Tom, absolutely, there's opportunities to look at more innovative ways of delivery, recognising what Eva said, there will always be people that won't want to go online and we can't force people. So our programme commitment is, you know, we would love for every citizen in Wales to be able to access online services and engage with digital technology in a safe way if they want to. If they don't, they should be able to access services other ways. Digital inclusion is about finding the hook that I think most people on this call will know. It's expensive, you know, when you're trying to work with people to encourage them to get online. If you say to them, you need an email address to access your bank account, they might not be interested in doing that. But actually, if you can kind of engage them in music or history or something that they really like, that they want to remember using technology, then you slowly bring them on the journey about why they might want to use other technology and engage with other services online. It takes time and it takes money, and it doesn't happen overnight. So the reality is, if we want to get the 7% of people in Wales digitally included, if we can, then there's going to have to be further investments, you know, because the reality is by 2026, that's not going to happen. The other thing as well for me is digital inclusion isn't linear. You know, people drop in and out of it. And we saw that in the pandemic. People that we normally think actually are fine, they weren't, because their connectivity didn't allow them to do Zoom calls for work and have the kids' lessons online as well. So we need to kind of recognise that spectrum about how people will drop in and out of it, rather than thinking that it's just that your journey starts here and then by the time you get to that point, you're digitally included, because you might not. Something might happen in the middle that actually sets you back a bit as well.
Yes, and that continuum that everyone is on, particularly in the cost of living crisis, you can imagine how people are going to be dipping in and out of that, and of course as technology develops. So yes, that minimum digital living standard is something that we are also part of with Liverpool University, and it's an incredibly important piece of work. Alan, did you have anything you wanted to add around that?
Not a terrible lot extra on top of that. Just, yeah, I suppose, yeah, facing down the cost of living crisis, digital inclusion does cost money. There's no way around that. So I kind of, that mix of the knowing the difference that digital inclusion can make to the lives of people to alleviate some of the pains of the cost of living crisis, and the investment to do that, versus cuts to public spending and actually what's going to be realistic in the year ahead. So I suppose slight trepidation about the future, and I suppose coming out of the wake of the pandemic as well, although, you know, it's still kind of ongoing. But where does digital inclusion sit in kind of the public narrative now? It was the essential lifeline. Do people still see the value and the benefit as much as we did maybe 18 months ago? So kind of looking around at that, but hopefully, as Tom said, a chance for innovation and to be a lot more creative about how we approach digital services, digital inclusion. I know definitely in Scotland as well, there seems to be appetite for the digital minimum living standard as well, and doing some work around that here too. So hopefully, yeah, creating a space for innovation.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that innovation point is incredibly important, but so is that narrative point. If the pandemic did one thing, we frequently say it shone a light on the difficulties that many people were having to get online. Those difficulties haven't gone away, but perhaps the urgency in the public mindset no longer sits there in the same way it did when children were being expected to learn from home. Working in the office wasn't a possibility. And in that way, it kind of caught attention, but now it seems to have dipped off that agenda a little bit. We are getting to the end of our session here, but there was one, well, there's quite a few more questions, so we might try and answer those through typed answers, but there's one more question that I really wanted to ask, because it ties in so much to what we're doing, which is, how can we put more pressure on the private sector to address digital poverty and inclusion. Giselle, you've talked a little bit about sort of the work in Wales around small businesses. Eva, Aaron, any thoughts on how we encourage that?
Yeah, sorry, I'll go first if that's okay. So I know that there are some schemes over in Northern Ireland run by the private sector already to tackle digital poverty. I know just for one example, PwC offer coding lessons and schemes for children to get into coding, just as there are some government run schemes like that as well. I think that they are coming from the angle that if they are teaching these children at a young age, they're creating their own workforce basically, which is probably a good way to look at it on a private sector angle. So PwC, just using them as an example, know that in the future they are going to need a lot more coders, if that's what they're called, and they so they know that they need to teach these children at quite a young age to be at the level that they will need once they're into the workforce. So I think the pressure is already there. The private sector already know the changing dynamics of the digital age and what it might look like in the future and what they will need in the future. So it's just putting pressure on them to sort of create that, to hopefully don't sound too cynical, but to create their own workforce. So that will tackle digital poverty in their own way.
Thanks so much. Aaron.
I think for me, the role of the private sector, I come back to with Scotland's digital strategy, following the kind of inclusion part, there's a section on an ethical digital nation and the role of digital ethics and what is an ethical digital nation. And for me, there's something about the private sector or parts of the private sector stand to gain so much from having people digitally included and using their platforms and buying products from their services online. So where it's going back to that collective responsibility, where does responsibility sit on those bodies in that case, and what can they do to better help digital inclusion? And something I always come back to is we see time and time again when we administer funding for the sector, a lot of time people go off and create resources and how-to guides for how to use basic platforms and apps. And they do that because a lot of times it doesn't actually exist from those that have developed those apps in the first place. And it just feels like such a waste of resource. And that goes back to people playing to their strengths and doing what you can do within the complexity of digital inclusion. So voluntary sector, yes, can go and do that trusted relationships, build skills and confidence. Can the private sector then do something around building the resources and support actually to help those people do that job, to access their services and platforms that they ultimately benefit from? So how do we shift some of that responsibility and narrative onto those designing these platforms and apps and have them play their role more, but not taking a stab too much at the private sector? Let everyone play to their strengths, I think.
That's a good note to finish on. If everyone does and can play to their strengths, then we really can solve digital poverty, but everybody does need to pull that weight. Huge thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to come back around you and ask you for a sort of 10-second closing words, and I will mean 10 seconds. Apologies to those people whose questions we weren't able to answer. I'm going to find out whether we have the technical ability to send you answers to those questions after this webinar is finished. Do go on the Community Hub, do ask these questions. We don't only need to have these conversations when we've got webinars running. This is a dialogue that we should be having all day, every day. Do sign up to our next DPA webinar, which is taking place same time, same place, 1 o'clock on the 26th of January, when we'll be joined by Matt Adam, the CEO and founder of We Are Digital, talking about the social impact of their model. That should be a really great session. We are already looking a little bit oversubscribed, but we'd love to have a few more people. We think we can probably fit a few more people into Zoom on that one. I'll just go back round. Aaron, final closing thoughts from you.
I'll just repeat what I've said before. It's digital inclusion is everyone's business. It's a collective responsibility, and everyone play to their strengths.
Thank you, Aaron. Giselle.
Okay. More than one government department should own digital inclusion. Coming back to Aaron's point, it should be everybody's responsibility. We're funded through health and social justice, and that makes a big difference in terms of the engagement we get with the health sector. So if we can kind of spread that across more departments, you'll get much better buy-in.
Fantastic. And Eva.
Yeah, so didn't think I was too cynical. It's not all doom and gloom, and we are improving over in Northern Ireland. It is a slow process, as it is with everyone, but we do have a lot of catching up to do.
Fantastic. Thank you thank you all once again. It's been a fantastic session. I personally have learned a lot, and I think looking at the chat, a lot of people have learned a lot of things as well. Final call to action, do jump on the hub, do have a look at the DPA website, do also think about what you could do, leaving this session, what you could do within your organisations, however small a change around digital poverty. Watch out for our national delivery plan, which will be coming out, and do feel free to get in touch direct, Elizabeth@digitalpovertyalliance.org. Love to hear from you. Thank you all again. Have a good rest of your week.